If I didn't introduce myself already, my name is Junaid Rahman. I'm Senior Regulatory Analyst in the Safety Policy Division, and I'll be going over the background and purpose of this workshop. Next slide, please. So AB 111 was passed in 2019 that mandated review as necessary safety and regulatory requirements for electric facilities, along with recommendations related to climate change. So as Commissioner Houck mentioned earlier, the Phase 2 scoping memo for this proceeding identified the need to update general orders to better align with climate adaptation efforts. And that's what brings us here today. The Safety Policy Division conducted a thorough review of the general orders to assess and identify necessary modifications aimed at addressing climate adaptation. Next slide, please. So just a brief CPUC procedural history of this proceeding. The order instituting rulemaking for 18-04-019 was established to integrate climate change adaptation matters in relevant CPUC proceedings, safeguarding California's utility access against climate threats. The CPUC to date has issued 2 decisions in Phase 1 of this rulemaking. The first decision is a decision on definition of data issued on November 1st, 2019, and it defines climate change adaptation for energy utilities in California. The second decision in Phase 1 of this proceeding was the decision on disadvantaged vulnerable communities and utility vulnerable assessments, which established community engagement plans and climate adaptation vulnerability assessments, or as we know it, CAVAs. Next slide, please. So this visual represents how CPUC's Phase 2 of this proceeding aligns with the broader strategic analysis at both the international and state levels. It is one component of a global effort. Next slide, please. Actually, I'll pause. Okay. So the workshop purpose. So this workshop will present findings from the Safety Policy Division's analysis of CPUC's general orders regarding rulemaking 18-04-019, specifically Phase 2, Task 6. Task 6 focuses on updating general orders to incorporate climate adaptation measures. This workshop aims to engage experts to gather insights on 3 possible strategies SPD proposes to update the general order in line with climate adaptation requirements. So today we are seeking to adequately incorporate climate adaptation into energy utility processes to increase ratepayer safety, reliability, and resilience, while having positive or neutral impacts on ratepayer affordability. We highly encourage an active discussion by the attendees of this workshop. Next slide. So I'll pause here if there are any questions from the audience. Okay. We can move on to the next module. So I'll now hand it off to Sarah Moore to discuss the California climate adaptation landscape. Sarah.
Thank you, Junaid. Next slide, please. This slide presents the 2 main reports produced by the state of California to inform the state's overarching approach to climate adaptation. First, we have California's climate change assessment, which is issued every 5 years and includes 9 downscaled regional reports using the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change global climate models. This informs the California Climate Adaptation Strategy, which is issued every 3 years, linking the state's vulnerability to strategies for addressing that vulnerability. Next slide. Here we see a list of the first efforts by California to assess the state's climate vulnerability and respond to it on a number of fronts, from sea level rise to extreme heat. These initial efforts laid the foundation for subsequent updates, some legislatively mandated, in addition to many other state initiatives to prepare for climate change. First, we have the climate change assessment, which was initiated in 2005 and published in 2006. As I noted, it is updated every 5 years and downscales the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change global climate models. Then in 2008, the state launched the California Climate Adaptation Strategy, published in 2009, and that's updated every 3 years. 2009, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment launched the first Indicators of Climate Change in California report, updated every 3 years since then. This gives us the baseline data to give us evidence-based policy. In 2010, we have the Ocean Protection Council's first sea level rise guidance, which has subsequently been updated 3 times. In 2011, the state launched its online mapping tool, caladapt.org, which allows users to locate themselves in the state in reference to climate hazards. This has since been updated. In 2012, the California Emergency Management Agency and California Natural Resources Agency launched the first California Adaptation Planning Guide. This planning guide supports local planning departments working on incorporating climate change considerations into their local hazard mitigation plans and the safety element of their general plans, which is legislatively mandated. In 2013, the California Environmental Protection Agency and the California Department of Public Health launched the Preparing California for Extreme Heat report, which has since been updated by Natural Resources Agency. These and many more subsequent actions have laid the groundwork for our state's approach to climate adaptation. Next slide, please. As described earlier by my colleague Junaid, phase 2 of the present climate adaptation proceeding is outlined in the June 2023 scoping memo, which includes 6 tasks. One of the tasks, task number 6, describes the possible need for updates to general orders for climate adaptation. Task 6 asks, should the Commission update any general orders to ensure they appropriately reflect climate adaptation needs? If so, which general orders merit consideration? What process should be used to update them? As part of phase 2, task 6, Safety Policy Division conducted an analysis of CPUC general orders. At this point, are there any questions? Anything anyone wants to add from my colleagues? See no questions. At any time, people can ask questions and they will be addressed at the end of each section. For now, let me hand this off to the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, Colin Lang, to hear that agency's insights on the dynamic risk of climate change on mitigating wildfire risk related to electrical infrastructure and equipment safety requirements. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. It's quite a mouthful. Good morning, everyone. My name is Colin Lang. I'm the Environmental Policy Supervisor at the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, and I'm here to talk about the office's work regarding addressing the dynamic risk of climate change and mitigating wildfire risk. Next slide, please. Just briefly, a quick agenda for my presentation. I'll go over energy safety's statutory authority to perform this work. We'll talk a little bit about energy safety's role as a wildfire mitigator and how it relates to climate mitigation. We'll talk about the research and inputs into the process at energy safety, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation, which is the areas for the CPUC to consider for general order modification. Next slide, please. Public Utilities Code section 326A7 authorizes the energy infrastructure safety to review, as necessary, the safety requirements for electrical infrastructure and provide recommendations to the CPUC to address the dynamic risk of climate change and to mitigate wildfire risk. So this is the code section that spurred energy safety's work in this area. For those of you who are not aware of energy safety is reviews and approves the electrical corporation's wildfire mitigation plans, as well as holds them in compliance to their approved plans. So energy safety is a wildfire safety oriented agency, but of course, we see wildfire mitigation as intertwined with climate change mitigation. And so I wanted to kind of draw the parallels between this scoping, this workshop, and the proceeding and the work at Energy Safety. Of course, reducing wildfire risk from utility infrastructure protects Californians. It makes them safer. It also makes ecosystems and wildlife and all of the living things that call this state home safer. Wildfire mitigations often have the co-benefit of increasing reliability throughout the grid. Vegetation management and grid hardening reduce outages overall. Wildfire mitigations also increase the resilience of the grid. Mitigations such as grid monitoring and weather forecasting allow utilities to both anticipate risk from climate hazards like wind and heat, but it also prepares the utilities to proactively respond and prepare for those climate-enhanced disasters. Some things that have been happening at Energy Safety related to Public Utilities Code 326. Of course, the office and its staff review the wildfire mitigation plans of the electrical corporations. We perform our evaluation, so we dig deeper into those plans than what is on the surface. We also have our wildfire mitigation plan maturity surveys that we review. We did hire a contractor between June 2022 and December 2023, which provided us with several reports, their review of the general orders, as well as some recommendations for how Energy Safety might consider asking the PUC to update those general orders to address climate change and wildfire risk. We held a workshop back in July of 2023, which discussed possible areas for general order modification to address climate change and wildfire mitigation. And our Wildfire Safety Advisory Board also provided recommendations and published policy papers in February of 2024 on this topic. Okay, dive into the areas that Energy Safety offers to the CPUC for consideration for general order modification. The first is regarding asset inventories. Asset inventories are necessary for recording essential information about electrical assets. We also believe that a robust asset inventory facilitates the evolution to component lifestyle management and away from the traditional run to failure model. Asset inventories can inform proactive inspections and maintenance of equipment, and also the timely identification and remediation of potential issues. It is Energy Safety's belief that if the utilities don't know where and what their equipment is, they cannot plan for future climate scenarios adequately. So for the CPUC's consideration, consider establishing general order requirements for asset inventories. We think they should be digital, geospatial, and include standard attributes and nomenclature to reduce confusion between different electrical corporations. Weather stations and data, we all see the value of the weather stations and weather forecasting and things like the calling of a public safety power shutoff. Forecasting weather is necessary to indicate high wildfire and climate risk scenarios and weather like Santa Ana winds. Of course, accurate weather data is necessary for operationally responding to high-risk conditions, such as disabling reclosers, initiating a PSPS, or to pause construction or to modify construction standards. Accurate weather forecasting and data also improves risk modeling, risk prioritization, and decision-making about operations, maintenance, and construction. As such, the CPUC should consider establishing general order requirements for weather stations that a lot of electrical corporations already have, including what those stations should be capable of, how those stations are placed throughout the service territory, how often those stations should be maintained or replaced, data collection standards, how often that weather data is collected. Is it every 2 seconds, every 10, every 2 minutes, every 10 minutes? And of course, how that data should be used in decision making. General Order 95, Rule 131 requires design, construction, and maintenance to be done in accordance with known local conditions. The general orders do not require the utilities to consider future climate conditions. And so the CPUC should consider modifying General Order 95 to require not only current known local conditions, but also future forecasted conditions. And consider climate change forecasts in the design, construction, and maintenance of equipment. Exempt and non-exempt equipment. Exempt equipment is designed to test and tested to limit the arcs and sparks and expelling of hot material during operation. The particular one that comes to mind is expulsion fuses. Replacing non-exempt equipment with exempt equipment would reduce the number of possible utility-related ignitions. The technology is out there. Some utilities are already replacing some non-exempt equipment with exempt equipment, but the CPUC should consider raising the minimum standard in high wildfire risk areas and modify General Order 95 to prohibit the installation of new non-exempt equipment in those high wildfire risk areas. They could consider prioritizing certain equipment, non-exempt equipment that has a higher likelihood of ignition, such as those expulsion fuses that I discussed, but as well as lightning arresters. The CPUC may also consider modifying General Order 95 to proactively replace non-exempt equipment with exempt equipment. Equipment installed prior to the inception and updates to GO95 may not meet the purpose of the rules, which is to secure safety to the public. A lot of this equipment is aged, and aged equipment and infrastructure is associated with increasing wildfire risk and risk of failure and ignition. As such, this commission should consider establishing general order requirements regarding the continued use of equipment that predates General Order 95 and consider under what conditions that equipment should be replaced. Risk-informed inspections. As we all know, certain electrical assets are more likely to cause an ignition, they're more likely to fail. Certain areas of the state have a higher likelihood of ignition and others have a higher consequence if an ignition occurs in that area. Similarly, general orders do not explicitly require the inspection of vegetation. General Order 95, Rule 35 requires that the utilities be in compliance with minimum clearance distances at all times, but it does not require the regular inspection of that vegetation to maintain those clearances. All this to say, the CPUC should consider modifying General Order 165 to require risk-based and risk-prioritized inspections of assets and vegetation in high wildfire risk areas. Remote devices can detect faults and other critical conditions and trigger automatic operations like de-energization or the dispatch of resources. You can think of this as PG&E's program, EPSS, or SCE's program, Fast Curve. But there are also other, devices like high definition cameras that can automatically dispatch firefighting resources if it detects a smoke plume. These remote devices can reduce the likelihood of a fault that causes an ignition, and it can also decrease response time to critical conditions sensed on or adjacent to electrical infrastructure. The CPUC should consider establishing general order requirements for the installation and maintenance of remote monitoring and operation devices. And they should also consider modifying General Order 95 to require lines in high wildfire risk areas to be fitted with protective devices whose response times can be increased and automatic group closers that are capable of being disabled. This one is regarding vegetation management in particular. The American National Standards Institute, ANSI, has their A300 tree care standards that provide standard practices and specifications for several things, but amongst them is the pruning of trees. Adherence to these standards ensure the health of the tree and reduces the need for and expense of repeated trimming and pruning. These industry standards are currently in use by all the electrical corporations, but they are not required to follow them. The CPUC, as such, should consider modifying General Order 95, Rule 35, and Table 1 to align with these pruning standards. To sort of wrap it all up, energy safety believes that given the changing climate, we need to think differently about the minimum standards and how the utilities design and construct and maintain the grid. I think I have provided some areas that energy safety believes the CPUC should consider for updating those minimum standards, and we wholeheartedly support the updating of general orders to mitigate climate change and wildfire risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. We'll pause for some questions from the audience before we move on. And just as a reminder, the chat function is available, so if you have questions during, feel free to put it in there. We'll collect them and we'll present that during the questions. Okay, with that, next slide, Sarah, please. So I'll hand it off now to Brittany Gaines, who will present our SPD's general order analysis. And I want to not remind, but also tell the audience that during the general order analysis and the findings, please feel free to, during the presentation, if you have questions or feedback, it's open to that as well. Thank you. Brittany?
Morning, everyone. My name is Brittany Gaines. I'm a research data specialist at SPD, and I will be discussing the general order analysis that we conducted. Next slide, please. In the Phase 2 scoping memo and ruling of this proceeding in Track 6, a need to update existing general orders to address climate adaptation requirements set by the state of California was raised. SPD staff were tasked with creating a process to address this need. The solution was a comprehensive analysis looking at themes and attributes of existing CPUC general orders pertaining to large electric utilities. Ultimately, general orders were evaluated on their ability to address the state's climate adaptation requirements and goals, as well as their fit within the scope of this proceeding. This analysis was grounded in and developed using the rigorously researched climate change standards and concepts reported in California's 4th Climate Change Assessment and the California Climate Adaptation Strategy. The main objective of this analysis was to identify a subset of existing 94 general orders that best address climate adaptation goals so that they could be considered for future adjustments to address the goals of this proceeding. Just to note that in this presentation, I will be discussing our methodology for conducting our general order analysis, and later we will discuss with Maria Jaya, who will go over the analysis findings, and Sarah Kareem will discuss potential strategies for adapting the general orders to suit the goals of this proceeding. This slide is just serves to give some background on the main priorities of the climate adaptation strategy. These priorities represent California state's approach and commitment to addressing our unique climate change challenges. These priorities were aligned into our general order analysis, and CPUC is also committed to ensuring that its actions ensure positive or neutral impacts on affordability for ratepayers. This comprehensive analysis focused on the themes and attributes of each of the 94 general orders as they relate to climate adaptation. Each general order was evaluated using a three-step process with specific inclusion criteria until only general orders that could best address the international and state climate adaptation goals were selected for. The first round of screening specified general orders that fit within the scope of this proceeding and contained themes related to climate adaptation. The second round selected for general orders that addressed 6 California climate adaptation priorities. And lastly, the third round, SPD and subject matter experts across the CPUC worked to evaluate the final general orders and selected the final general orders that were selected at round 1 and 2 to determine which ones could most feasibly be altered and aligned with the climate adaptation priorities. At this step, they also categorized 9 themes among these final general orders to organize how they address climate adaptation. For the first round screening, this slide details the inclusion and exclusion criteria we used. General orders that targeted industries fitting within the scope and that could incorporate themes that consider changing climate were selected at this round. General orders that included industries such as rail, railway, and trains, or that were for ministerial or financial purposes, were excluded due to their incompatible fit within the scope of this proceeding. For more specific details, the table to the left shows general order themes that fit this round's inclusion criteria, and the table to the right shows the exclusion criteria. This screening was exclusionary, so if any exclusion criteria were met in a general order, it would not have been selected. These are the outcomes of the first round screening. There were 16 general orders included at this round of screening that were found to include some theming or elements that address climate adaptation attributes listed to the left. There were 78 general orders excluded due to either not fitting within the scope or not including themes that could address climate adaptation. The table below shows criteria, themes, and how many general orders fit them. And just a note, the number of general orders per inclusion criteria is not mutually exclusive, meaning general orders could contain multiple climate adaptation themes. For the second round of screening, 6 questions were established to evaluate how general orders address climate change based on the 6 California climate adaptation priorities. These 6 questions pertain to how each general order addressed a climate adaptation concern. They include themes such as modification, continuity of service failure, facility design, technological advancement, repetitive loss or repair of infrastructure, and consideration of hazard or vulnerability, all as they pertain to adapting to or addressing a changing climate. There were 11 GOs found to address these climate priorities and align with the state climate adaptation initiatives. This list is also not mutually exclusive, as many general orders address multiple priorities presented in these questions. In the third round, SPD staff, in collaboration with subject matter experts across CPUC, and you can see their divisions are depicted to the right, they met to evaluate each of the 11 general orders that had been selected thus far from round 1 and 2. Their objective at this screening round was to evaluate the feasibility of altering general orders to address climate adaptation priorities. After a careful qualitative review of these final general orders, 6 general orders were included because they address climate adaptation priorities at all levels, both state and international, and as we found in rounds 1 and 2, but they also could be feasibly adjusted to address the aims of this proceeding. 5 general orders were excluded due to their inability to be modified for the purposes of this proceeding, or because they already address climate adaptation requirements. In summary, the analysis had 3 rounds where each of the initial 94 general orders were evaluated based on state and international priorities and standards set for climate adaptation. 6 general orders were selected for their feasibility of fit and ability to address climate adaptation aims of this proceeding. While collaborating with subject matter experts, SPD was also able to see similarities and consistencies among the general orders as they relate to climate adaptation. They worked together to derive 9 thematic categories that each of the general orders addressed, which were also found in the climate assessment and climate adaptation priorities. These categories help to define lanes and strategically approach how these general orders could be modified to better suit climate adaptation. Here you can see the list of these thematic categories present among the final 6 general orders. There was site selection, construction, equipment tolerance, repetitive loss, reporting requirement, inspections, system failure, reconstruction, and processes. To the right of this graphic, you can see a short explanation of each theme, but further explanations of them and how they relate to each general order will be explained in the next presentation with my colleague Maria Jaya, as she discusses the findings of our analysis. This concludes my presentation of our analysis methodology. I would like to now open the floor for any questions people might have. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat or come off mute or raise your hand.
And this is an opportunity, if you have any initial reactions or thoughts, this is a good time to engage in a conversation. I'll give it a minute.
I see a hands up
Oh,
from
you do?
Nathan Burke. Nathan?
Yeah, Sarah, can you Sarah, can you unmute Nathan? Let's see.
I think people should be able to unmute themselves.
Nathan, you can unmute. We see your hand. Nathan, go ahead.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. Thank you for the overview. My question was, will we talk today about the 5 that were excluded at the end for either being unalterable in this proceeding or because they're already addressed climate adaptation requirements? This is mostly out of curiosity. I'd really be curious which 5 those are.
Hi, this is Audrey Williams. I'm supervisor of the Security and Resilience Branch. I think we do talk about it a little bit briefly in the next section, so we can save that conversation for then if you want. But I think what we also want to talk about is that we're open to, like, obviously this is a qualitative analysis, and so we're open to having a discussion around which general orders were included and which were excluded ultimately. So although we think that we presented a robust analysis and will continue to present a robust analysis over the course of the day, part of this conversation, part of the reason that we're having this workshop is to have that conversation. So perhaps after the next section, we can dive in a little bit deeper.
Thank you, Nathan. Anyone else in the audience? I will now, next slide, please, Sarah. I'll now introduce Maria Jaya, who will present SPD's findings and thematic categories. Maria.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you, Brittany. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending this workshop. My name is Maria Jaya with the Safety Policy Division. I'm a Senior Public Utilities Regulatory Analyst, and for today's workshop, I will be presenting our findings and thematic categories for the climate adaptation. Evolving climate risks and natural hazards such as flooding, sea level rise, earthquake, and others requires our commission to examine current general orders. We may need to modify these general orders to enhance resilience, minimize disruptions, and protect the communities. Thematic categories for climate adaptation could facilitate a structured approach, meaning systematic and organized framework that guides our actions while allowing room for adjustments. Think of it as a scaffold. It's solid enough for us to support growth, but adjustable depending on the shape that we're trying to build. On the next slide, we will show that through the rigorous methodology my colleague Brittany described previously, we identified the 6 general orders within this proceeding that could be modified to further enhance energy utilities responsibility for climate adaptation. These general orders include General Order 95, which establishes the safety and construction standards for overhead electric line infrastructures. General Order 128, that provides regulations for the design, construction, and maintenance of underground electric and communication system. General Order 165, that specifies inspection and maintenance cycles for electric distribution infrastructure. General Order 166, that sets emergency operation, reliability, and safety requirements for utilities to follow during disasters and emergencies. General Order 167B, that enforces maintenance and operational performance standards for electric power generation facilities. And lastly, General Order 174 establishes safety and reliability rules for electric utility substations. On the next slide, in this slide, as a reminder, these are the 9 thematic categories that was previously introduced. The key thematic categories for climate adaptation include site selection, which considers requirements for selecting a site on energy projects. The purpose is to ensure infrastructures are placed in areas with minimal exposure to climate hazards and emergencies such as flooding, earthquakes, storms, and other hazards. In construction, we consider requirements for constructing a new energy infrastructure to withstand climate impacts during its lifespan. So for example, by using climate resilient materials or applying certain building techniques. For equipment tolerance, it applies to requirements that ensures energy infrastructure is durable enough to endure climate events or emergencies while minimizing significant or costly damage. In repetitive loss, those are requirements that relates to loss of infrastructures, whereas reconstructions are requirements on rebuilding damaged infrastructures. The purpose is to minimize chronic damage and ensure resilient rebuilding. Inspections are requirements on inspecting and maintaining infrastructures, and reporting requirements relate to assessment of climate impacts or emergencies for reporting to CPUC. The purpose of these requirements are to strengthen our oversight and transparency in ensuring continuous maintenance to prevent climate-related infrastructure failure. In system failure response, Those are requirements for improving emergency preparedness and responses to service disruptions caused by climate-related hazards and emergencies. Lastly, processes refers to requirements prompted by the engagement with state and other entities, such as leveraging strategies from the California Climate Adaptation Strategies or assessments from the California Fourth Assessment, and so on. Okay. On the next slide, the table lays out the 9 thematic categories for climate adaptation on the left and the 6 general orders to the right. This table shows different lenses for organizing potential changes on climate adaptation. You can organize by general order for a specific thematic category, which looks at the table vertically. So for example, for General Order 95, it encompasses almost every single thematic categories for climate adaptation. Or you could organize by themes by cutting across several general orders, which looks at the table horizontally. One benefit of using the same theme across different general orders is that we keep the same consistency in terms of lens across the diverse infrastructures. These are examples of what organizing by thematic categories could look like. So for example, for infrastructure site selection theme, these could be general orders 95 for overhead lines, 128 for underground systems, and 174 for electric substations. For scope and frequency of inspections, it spans across general orders 128 for underground systems, 165 electric distribution, and 174 electric substations. For mandatory reporting, it involves looking at the general orders 128 for underground systems and 166 for emergencies operation. For design and construction, it spans across general orders 128 for underground systems, 165 for electric distribution, and 174 for electric substation. In conclusion, the general order analysis present 2 lenses of how we could organize our approach to climate adaptation. One that focuses on individual general orders, while the other uses thematic categories that spans across multiple general orders. So thank you, and this concludes my portion of the presentation for this workshop. Is there any question on what I just presented or any thoughts from the group that you'd like to add to this conversation?
I will scan the room to see if there's any hands raised. I'll give one last call for even feedback or commentary or initial reactions to the general order analysis and findings. I'll have much more opportunity in the second half to go into depth, but I want to give everyone an opportunity while it's fresh. Okay, so Audrey, 30-minute break. Do you want to keep it clean? Return at 10:20 or 10:30?
10:20. Let's return at 10:20. We're kind of speeding through our morning here, so we'll give everyone a little bit of a longer break, and we'll start earlier, and then we can just end the workshop a little bit earlier if that's where we end up.
And let everyone marinate on it a little bit and have a cup of coffee. And we'll return at 10:20, everyone. Thank you. give it a minute, and then I'll ask for a quick thumbs up to verify people are back in the room. Okay. Can I ask one more time, 1021, those that haven't already given a thumbs up, please give a thumbs up that you're back before I hand it on. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so welcome back from break, everyone. Before we move on to the next module, which will be proposed regulatory approaches, we have responses to Nathan's question in the earlier segment, and Chris Parks after that. You could ask your question as well. So Maria.
Thanks, Jeanette. So this is in response to Nathan's question about the 5 excluded general orders. So 3 of them, which is the gas general orders, were ruled out because of existing federal regulations. These are the general orders 58, 94, and 112. We also ruled out GO 177 because it's already addressing the state decarbonization goals. And then also we ruled out GO 103 for water because there's already existing state requirement from the state water resource control boards about developing an emergency response. I think there is also one question from Stuart from PG&E about GO 167B. The analysis of the GO was definitely done before the update, so we will be reviewing the GO 167 update.
I think also to add, because GO 95 was mentioned, obviously work on GO 95 is ongoing in an open proceeding. So it's the same answer for GO 167. Whatever modifications happen to GO 95 in the current work will be considered in this analysis moving forward.
So Nathan and Stuart, any response or further questions? Okay, I got a thank you from Stuart. So I think we can move on to Chris Parks. This is an opportunity. You had a question regarding GO 167 and GO 95.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, Chris Parks from Cal Advocates. So I'm going to post in the chat a link to, let me see if this goes through. Actually, I could share it too really quick. Let me see if I can.
We'll pause there. I don't know how it's going to logistically work, but you can just talk to it and we can revisit it at the end.
Sure, fair enough. So what I was going to mention is in this link, there was, I think a big part of the climate adaptation considerations in this rulemaking is to consider, the effects of climate, including wildfires. And so there was a report that the commission developed from consultants in Vista. And if you were to go to this page of this InVista root cause analysis, so this is a root cause analysis of the Northern California wildfires, and they made some specific recommendations for potential changes to CPUC general orders. And so what I was going to highlight is if you were to go to that particular page number, they list some specific recommendations for improvements, and it includes, for example, this is related to General Order 167. It talks about adopting maintenance standards from General Order 167 into the Commission's General Order 95. So that's a way of addressing, the impacts of climate in terms of wildfire. So I wasn't sure if the commission is looking at that as part of the effort for this general order revision process, but I was going to highlight that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think we'll take that under advisement definitely. And I think part of the approaches that Sarah Kareem is about to go through will help, is similar to what you're talking about here, and should kind of align with actually this thought process. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for sending the link as well. So with that, before we move on, any other questions from the audience in response to any of this conversation that we just had? Okay. So now I will now hand it off to Sarah Kareem, who will now discuss our proposed regulatory approaches. And again, I guess I just want to reiterate the structure is we kind of set the table in the first half. Now in the second half, we are now making our proposals, and we hope that we will engage with the audience to, as we go through the slides, please feel free to give reactions, feedback, and engage. Thank you. Sarah.
Thanks, Junaid. Good morning, all. My name is Sarah Kareem. I am a regulatory analyst in Safety Policy Division. And like Junaid mentioned, I am going to share some proposed courses of actions that are based on Safety Policy Division's findings from the analysis that my colleagues presented in the first half of the workshop. Each approach is a different mechanism, but these are the things we want to consider throughout. Safety Policy Division developed these considerations through the scoping memo and in discussion with CPUC leadership. And we want to ensure that they are incorporated in each of the courses of action that we'll put to you in the next slide. We aim to, one, support the resilience of electric utilities and not only guide future rulemaking, but also be consistent and complementary to existing rulemaking. We also seek to minimize damage caused by system failures, major outages, and climate hazards. And finally, maintain affordability for ratepayers. These are the three courses of action that we put to you all today. Approach number one is to move forward with updating individual general orders through separate proceedings or one larger proceeding with multiple tracks and phases. Approach number two is to establish standards and rules for climate adaptation through a general order. And approach number three is to establish standards and rules for climate adaptation through a CPUC decision. I'll go into more detail on each approach over the next few slides. And I also want to note that these approaches are not mutually exclusive, so some combination of the three is also possible. The first approach or course of action would be to update each individual general order. One example of how this could be implemented is through GO-128. The present language discusses the design, construction, and maintenance of electrical supply and communication systems. The way GO-128 is written now, climate adaptation considerations are not explicit, but we could modify the present language to include the consideration of climate hazard projections in the siting of electrical infrastructure, just as an example. Some things to consider with this approach: on the one hand, addressing general orders individually allows for a more tailored modification to address climate adaptation, and individual decisions could be amended through the petition for modifications process or fully replaced by new decisions. On the other hand, it would require individual proceedings for each identified general order from our analysis, or one large proceeding with multiple tracks and phases. And this could make future maintenance and modification of those decisions more complex. Course of action two is to write a new general order on climate adaptation. A new general order could integrate climate change considerations into infrastructure development and maintenance, which would be organized by the 9 thematic categories that we identified. It could integrate climate hazard projections in the site selection of electrical infrastructure. It could also require electrical IOUs to provide reports on projects that are organized by the 9 thematic categories in the short to medium term time span. And it could establish a working group that would meet monthly to share best practices in these areas. Some things to consider with this approach is that general orders can create an umbrella over certain topics, such as making it the general order on climate adaptation, and centralize and provide a foundation for coordination of future modification of climate adaptation rules and standards. However, general orders may require more coordination to modify than individual decisions. And because of that, creating a general order can take a long time compared to a decision. Finally, the third course of action is to implement these changes through a decision under R.18-04-019. This could involve creating some encompassing climate adaptation documents through the current proceeding and would not directly modify any general order. And it could achieve similar ends as the example I gave for creating a new general order and apply to the general orders that we identified in our analysis. The advantages of this approach is that decisions are more flexible and easier to change to respond to new science and environments. Also, decisions can be more targeted and specific. However, we may not want flexibility in our approach. Decisions are also less centralized than general orders to enable future modification, but this may make future maintenance and modifications more complex. And with that, I will open the floor for any questions on our proposed approaches before we go to the panel. And I also want to note, if you have any questions or comments that you want to be addressed by the panel, please feel free to share them now.
So if there's any initial reactions to the proposed 3 courses of action, this is an opportunity to bring it up now.
I can go back to that slide so you guys can all see the 3 of them laid out.
Okay, and we could always circle back.
Yeah.
After. So then we'll now move on to our next module. I'll hand it off to Audrey Williams, who will moderate the panel on climate adaptation policy. Audrey.
I know that we're early, so I just want to make sure that all of our panelists are currently present on the call. You guys could come off mute and identify yourselves.
Eugenie here, can you hear me?
Yes, Nathan, I can hear you.
Right.
Sandeep is here, SDG.
Hi, Sandeep.
Colin Lang from Energy Safety.
Hi, Colin. I think we're waiting on SCE.
This is Anna Markway from SCE. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Anna.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. We're speeding through the day, so hopefully we can take a little bit longer with this panel and really have an in-depth discussion about what we've presented, general orders more broadly, climate adaptation policy at CPUC, and where you all see gaps and places that we can fill in those gaps and approaches to filling in those gaps. I want to start out by going around the room or around the panel and having everyone introduce themselves, say a little bit about themselves and kind of initial reactions to the things that we've heard today, both from CPUC and from OEIS. And then I'll go in and with some moderated questions that are similar to the questions that were sent out in the ruling questions prior to the workshop. I would also encourage any of the attendees of the workshop to drop questions into the chat, and I'll pose them to the panel as well. So Sandeep, since you're first in my vision, do you want to go first?
Sure. No, thank you very much, Audrey. I'm Sandeep Botla. I'm the Director for Fire Science and Climate Adaptation at SDG.
And as part of that job, I have the privilege of leading our meteorology function, our fire coordination function, as well as the climate adaptation policy and analytics team. I'm first very grateful to be invited to the part of this workshop and to participate in the panel. I commend everybody who's been working on going through these general orders, trying to figure out applicability and then the thematic alignment. I'm also particularly happy to see the WMP, wildfire piece through OEIS energy safety being addressed in the same context, because we also view this in a very integrated manner at SDG&E. And yeah, I look forward to the questions and to engaging on this topic on how we operationalize all the work we've done in CAVA and make it actionable.
Thanks, Sandeep. Anna, do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you so much. My name is Anna Brockway. I'm a senior advisor in integrated planning and climate adaptation at Southern California Edison. And my team is responsible for climate adaptation across the company, as well as our upcoming CAVA filing in 2026. And I want to commend the CPUC on your initial effort in reviewing and down selecting these general orders. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Colin, how about you go next?
Colin Lang, Environmental Policy Supervisor at the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. My small team specifically is in charge of looking at the vegetation management aspects of the Electrical Corporation wildfire mitigation plans, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about the environment and climate as a whole, and how it can inform energy safety policies and decisions, as well as our collaboration with the PUC. We're excited that this workshop is being held and that this work is moving forward, and we look forward to collaborating with the CPUC more.
Great, thank you. And finally, Nathan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Bengtson. I'm the Senior Manager of Enterprise Climate Resilience here at PG&E. We really exist to help integrate the climate risk perspective throughout the business. And so we think about this in a systems way, including our relationship to the regulatory process. And so we're very excited to share what we've learned over the last 5 years plus of doing this work, and hopefully further informing and aligning how climate comes through in these various processes. So very excited to be having the conversation. And I'll echo Sandeep and Anna in saying grateful for the analysis SPD provided on the geos themselves. I think that's really a useful basis for starting this conversation. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, Sarah, do you want to advance to the next slide? So I've pushed out some questions here. I'll post them to the group. I think these questions are, as I said in the beginning, a starting point. We as staff and as the CPUC are interested in not only how to meaningfully move forward with this work as the next steps and getting the opinions of the group on that, but also, as I said previously, what are those gaps that need to be filled in? So I think that the first question, as it's stated here, is how is climate change adaptation currently incorporated in utility planning processes in the short, medium, and long term? And taking that question to kind of further draw out what are some gaps that you identified in that current process, which is the next. So I open that up to the group, whoever wants to kind of go first. Hopefully someone will jump in. If not, I can call on somebody.
I should take the first part. Sorry, was Nathan going first? Sorry, Nathan, did I cut you off? Apologies. So I'll take the first part on how is climate change adaptation currently incorporated into our planning process in the short, medium, and long term. And I think for us, it's been since the time I've been overseeing it, it's been a two-pronged approach. One is how we are organized. So for background, we have a wildfire and climate science division at SDG&E. And as part of that division, we have fire science and climate adaptation, the team I lead, working very closely with wildfire mitigation planning and emergency management. And what that allows us to do is we can look at these cross-cutting themes and address them in whatever avenues are possible. And wildfire mitigation plan is a great example of how we are already executing on a lot of things we've identified climate adaptation points towards. The second part of the approach has been what Nathan was also saying, systems thinking, how do we multi-solve? So we've put a lot of time into thinking about the digital tools we have in place today. We use the digital twin capability and have identified this platform, which is called the Climate Intelligence Platform, building on the models we had developed for wildfire mitigation planning. So for those familiar with WMP, there's a lot of work that has gone into WINGS planning and WINGS ops, which allows you to look at the themes, the sites, and the construction standards, vegetation management, tolerance, circuit lists, PSPS planning. So there's a lot of integration that takes place digitally to help us be situationally aware and respond. So that same principle has been applied to climate intelligence to expand the aperture to include all hazards that were identified in CAVA. So we have taken that approach that you need to first visualize the vulnerability before you decide what tools and investments and plans you need to put in place. And that intelligence tool allows us to think about three things: the exposure to the hazards we've studied, the assets that are in place today from all of the GIS databases, and then the community vulnerability, and understand the intersection of those three elements to inform how we think about hotspots, the need for change, the needs for enhancement. So that's the two-pronged approach on how we're doing it. It then serves both the short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And as part of the CAVA process, so SDG&E is going to file its CAVA next month. We've actually organized it to think about 2030, 2050, 70, but then also the observed baseline. So from 2019 all the way up to 2080, we've looked at exposure data and modeled it based on the principles that were sort of enshrined into regulation back in 2019. But we've integrated that into how do we think about this more granularly, right? So there's a lot of data, climate data, that's very coarse. And the inherent part of this exercise is balancing the observed with the projected and dealing with the uncertainty in the projected to make sure all the actions you do today are not just informed, but are not forcing you to maladapt. So I think that's where we are on how do we visualize it, how do we act on it. The last thing is, when I said organizing, it's not just the organization of this division. We have a climate advisory group of over 75 members, engineers, to the employees who are very engaged on environmental climate mitigation actions, decarbonization strategy. So we've had this structure in place for, I say, the last 5 years, where we meet quarterly beyond just the core CAVA team to make sure we are sharing what we're learning with the teams. Yes, we can have the geos, but the important thing was anything we do and understand, we were sharing it with everyone who's engaged on this in a variety of roles across the enterprise. I'll hand it over to Nathan and Anna.
I think Anna came off mute before me, so please, Anna, jump in.
Sure, thank you. So the climate adaptation work at Southern California Edison also exists within an internal governance structure where we have representation from all of our operating units that work on assets and that work on planning for our system. And we think about our work also in kind of a couple of different categories. And one of those categories is really focused on the CAVA filings, the Climate Adaptation Vulnerability Assessment filings. So SC was the first California IOU to file a CAVA in 2022. And then we went through the process of taking those investments and putting them into our general rate case, which we filed in 2023 for the time period of 2025 to 2029. And we are now in the analysis phase for our next CAVA, which will be filed in May 2026. And so we've learned quite a bit through this process. And we've been learning from the other IOUs as well, and from other folks in the state who are working on these things. And we're excited to share some of those learnings with all of you. One of the things that we've learned is that CAVA is a really good mechanism for looking at existing assets and understanding what kind of assets and systems we already have in place, how those assets and systems perform and work, and where climate hazards may impact those in a way that challenges the normal and reliable operation of our system. And so we think that continuing that kind of CAVA effort, where with every iteration we learn more about how to do this work, and we learn more about how to do this work better, and really taking that through that understanding of what are the climate hazards we're facing, to how are they impacting the kinds of assets and operations that we have on our grid, And how do we start to make investments to make those assets and systems more reliable and resilient in the face of climate change? One of the other things that we've really learned, though, as we've been doing that work is the need to move more towards proactive planning. So not only looking at the existing assets and systems as they exist today, and understanding where do we need to potentially harden or make some modifications to prepare ourselves better for a climate change future. But also given the immense amount of load growth that we expect on our system and throughout California, and the infrastructure investment that will need to accompany that load growth to really prepare for that load growth, to enable it and make it possible. We will need to do that infrastructure investment, and we have existing planning processes that essentially do the work of understanding where we will need additional capacity in our system, where we need additional infrastructure investments. And we think a really, really important step is informing those proactive planning processes with climate information. So planning processes that are taking temperature, for example, a temperature time series, are looking at temperature as it will be in the future for the type of future that the assets that were built will actually operate in, as opposed to looking at historical data. And so as part of that, we were really happy to see that in the August 2024 phase 2 decision in the climate adaptation proceeding. So this was less than a year ago. There was an additional decision that specifically asked IOUs to incorporate climate projections into relevant planning processes and proceedings by 2027. And those proceedings were specifically defined as those that have longer term planning horizons, 5+ years, define grid investment needs for long-lived assets, define investment plans or approaches for long-lived assets, and guide planning processes that currently incorporate weather information. So, for example, take temperature time series. And we have really started to do that work. We've really embarked on that work. It's I think a little bit of a continuous improvement process, right? Like we really need to understand these planning processes really deeply to know where it is appropriate to feed climate information into them and the best ways in which to do that. And we do a lot of that work in collaboration, in deep collaboration, California's climate science research community, to make sure we're using the climate data kind of as appropriate and consistent with the guidance that CPUC has given. So that's so I think I'm really glad we're having this conversation, and I think we need to consider kind of some of these questions around general orders, kind of echoing Sandeep, kind of in the scope of the great work that's already been happening, both on existing assets through the CAVA work and through some of the CPUC guidance and ongoing utility work on incorporating climate into planning processes. With that, I'll pause and pass it to Nathan.
Great. Yeah, so I'd like to approach this sort of from a system or investment planning perspective, because that's really where the priorities of the CPUC, our customers, and PG&E are made real, and then presented, of course, to CPUC in the form of the general rate case. So just like Sandeep and Anna mentioned, we exist as a networked entity within PG&E. We really support other processes and groups in ensuring that climate information can be integrated into their process so that we're making climate-informed decisions. That's the goal. To sort of lay out the strategic problem, there are benefits to near-term adaptation in the long run, but revenue to invest in climate resilience is limited because we have existing investment priorities, and we also need to respect affordability and make sure that we're not, making rates unsustainable for our customers. And that means that we have to represent climate risk in a way that allows us to compare apples to apples with other risks that we're managing through the, SMAP/RAMP risk-based decision-making process. Now, CAVA is in some ways the beginning of representing that risk for us. So as Sandeep and Anna mentioned, having the climate adaptation and vulnerability assessment is a critical first step in understanding the impacts that we expect climate to have to our infrastructure. But there's a gap in terms of needing to then take those outputs and translate them directly into risk. The good news is that's a known gap. And within the risk-based decision-making framework proceeding, we're actually on deck to create a climate risk integration white paper that will do more to advance how we represent climate risk within the RAMP framework. That's really important because, like I said, there's not a lot of room in the bill to do additional resilience investments because of affordability. And so we need to be able to compare these priorities and really make sure that we're investing in the highest value, multi-benefit kind of solutions so that we're able to maintain affordability and performance today and into the climate altered future. I'll just say one more time that the timescale of this problem and the uncertainty involved are part of what makes it difficult to represent these risks in a similar way. And so that's one place where we're focused. We're currently in the process of scoping our 2027 climate adaptation vulnerability assessment, and we're having lots of meetings with both the investment planning teams and the risk assessment teams to make sure that what we create can be absorbed into their processes. So just to tie it back to general orders for a moment, I think it's a yes and kind of proposition. I think there are a lot of processes that need to be climate informed at the IOUs in order to make sure that we're building resilience over time in an affordable and sustainable way. The general orders may be one way to do that. Like I sort of alluded to, we're already doing that in the risk assessment process, increasingly starting to do that in the investment planning process. And we also are reviewing our own design standards right now to make sure that our design and equipment is robust enough for the entire life of the asset and won't have to be replaced early. So those are a few things we're doing, and I hope that it was helpful for me to sort of lay out how we think about it from the CABA through RAMP, then GRC, and actually building resilience. I'll stop there for now.
Absolutely helpful. Colin, do you have, I know you're not from a utility, but do you have anything to add on this?
A little different perspective. I'll say that, a couple things that energy safety has been looking at for a few years now. Back in 2023, we held scoping meetings on climate change and community vulnerability integration into utility, particularly electrical corporation, wildfire risk modeling. And at the time, there was not a lot of consensus on how to do that. It sounds like SDG&E has made some headway in that, which is great to hear. But we continue to hold a risk model working group at Energy Safety to try to best align how the electrical corporations are thinking about wildfire risk modeling and planning. And, we want to, part of what we want to do with those scoping meetings, as well as the ongoing risk model working group, is to ensure that the electrical corporations are not planning this in a silo and that they're learning from each other during these processes, because it is that's in part of why this workshop is really important, just bringing us all together to discuss these matters as one and understand and use common language. I'll also just note that both the representatives from SCE and SDG&E highlighted the importance of their accurate asset inventories in planning, which was one of the items that I brought up in my presentation.
I can take second part of the question, Audrey. And this is interesting because the gaps, which I'm going to talk about, are not just gaps in climate adaptation planning in the utility process. They are just gaps in general that make the planning process really cumbersome and difficult to implement. And the two that come to mind, the very first one is the temporal resolution and the application of that temporally across models, right? So Anna touched on load forecasting. We are doing the same thing, but when we embarked on that, it became very clear to the team that the load forecasting models require you to think about things on a daily, hourly frequency. And everything we study for climate modeling is at best at a decadal cycle. And then as you start translating that, you lose a lot of detail and nuance and even implication. And sometimes you may come up with an answer that is not as applicable to the planning process. So what we've had to do is think about the observed values, right? So historically, when you did load forecasting, you looked at data, 30-year averages. So we didn't discard that. We incorporated our downscaled view at a temporal resolution that made sense to marry the two to see where the biases could be and then correct it. So that's just complicated, right? It's not a one-for-one application of climate change models into the current planning process. It requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding of both processes for both groups to make sure the interpretation is fit for utilities. So that's one, but we are doing that, and it's a beginning of how do you make sure this is being used? How is the data used as well as useful, right? The second challenge you face in this scenario is climate change modeling and climate data has a lot of inherent uncertainty. And for us, as we think about planning and investments, there has to be a degree of certainty to make sure the solution is fit for purpose. There has to be very little to no room for maladaptation or having to do it twice, because we all want to make sure the rate impacts are equitable and justifiable to get traction on this planning. So that also requires the appreciation and understanding of how inherently uncertain some of the data could be and the need to keep refining it, right? So what that does is it predicates the need for these data models to be made available in a manner that can be translated, are accessible, are not too expensive, and hold some universal truths that are actionable. And that's very hard to do, just by the very nature of what this is. But that is not a detriment to understanding it, visualizing it, viewing it. It's just how do you implement it with a dollar sign that has a requirement for certainty, both on the cost benefit side, where the definitions of cost and benefit here, have to be predefined as far as what is under the utilities jurisdiction and control, right? So if you're going to think about the probabilities or the thresholds for risk, you have vulnerability, but what does that translation look like? It's not one for one. Now, the good news is, and Colin can attest to it, on wildfire, we've had to do that. We've had to think about the probability of ignition. We've had to think about what goes into a fire weather. We've had to think about the consequence in terms of financial reliability and safety impacts. Now, we've done that for fire, but is that the right approach for all hazards? And where do we account for the community adaptive capacity? How do we think about all of this cost benefit with a value that's ascribed beyond the value that we control that justifies the investment, right? So the planning process, the end point is you plan because you want to act and you want to invest and you want to correct, or even you want to change something. So those are the, the multi-dimensional complexity. I'm putting it under gaps, but it's not the gap in the planning process. It's a gap, and I don't even want to call it a gap. It's a challenge that we all need to grapple with, even when we update the geos. But I'll hand it over to maybe Anna or Nathan, whoever wants to go next.
Seeing Nathan's not unmuting himself, so I'm happy to go next, but Nathan, please feel free to jump in also. I think, yeah, there's an immense amount of work I think that is required in all of this, and we are doing that work right now through the common processes and then through climate informing planning processes, as I had previously discussed before. I think a lot of the gaps in our minds are kind of exist throughout that work in different ways. And I really appreciate some of the gaps that Sandeep outlined, because those are ones we're seeing also. But I think maybe I would frame this a little bit as just this is a continuous improvement process, right? Like we can start climate informing some of the work that we do. We're not going to do it all immediately. We're not going to be able to change every planning process immediately. And it's really about starting and being kind of in the early stages of working towards both planning processes that are climate informed, design standards that are climate informed, and thinking through with our engineers and our internal experts, what are the best ways to take some of these climate hazards and really reflect them in our planning standards. And some of those are things that we kind of know, right? There are relationships for how temperature impacts some of our assets. Some of those are things that we don't know as well, because some of the decisions have been made in the past based on rules of thumb in future operating conditions, right? And so there isn't as clear of a link between how is the climate changing and how does a particular standard or planning process really need to be updated. But we are doing this currently in the planning process piece in our integrated resource plan, where the IRP that we will be filing will include generation D rates due to climate change and climate projections. And then in our distribution planning process, where we are incorporating load projections that are climate informed and have better and more robust temperature granularity and assumptions. And we are evaluating other planning processes for where and how climate projections can be appropriately incorporated. And a lot of that work really, I think, leads directly into asset sizing and how do we best size our assets for the future that they will face, for the kind of load that they will face in the future, for the kind of temperature we will face in the future, to prepare for our future capacity needs by incorporating that throughout our distribution system and throughout our kind of systems in general. I think geos are, as Nathan and Cindy have already kind of said, I think are a part of this, but understanding exactly where they fit into this landscape is it feels so case by case, right? Like we're talking about so many different things as soon as we start talking about climate informing planning processes and climate informing utility work, that you really have to get into the weeds of any particular thing you are talking about, I think, to understand what is the best mechanism for this particular impact, for this particular climate impact on this particular piece of equipment, on this particular piece of the system, to know, is that something that happens through a planning process, which is already covered by the climate proceeding? Is this something that happens through CABA and through a GRC request that come out of CABA, again, already covered through the climate proceeding? Or is this something potentially better suited to a general order? And I think we really have to get in the weeds of that. It's hard to speak about it in broad terms.
Thank you, Anna. I think that's really helpful. We are talking about all these different regulatory processes that we have, and the general orders are so foundational to the way that CPUC governs. And so I think that it's important, that's why we're having this conversation, to make sure, especially when you start to talk about specific regulations of assets, and that is so integral and so into many of the geos that we talked about today. So I take that point, and I think it's really useful, especially about the in the weeds piece of it, that it is a very specific and technical conversation that needs to be had. And that's where we're trying to kind of start this conversation here. So I had said this previously, but I want to say it again, is that this is just us kind of very broadly bringing up this topic, and it's the beginning of what's going to be a much larger conversation over the next, year, and us trying to kind of develop something that's useful and good and achieves these aims. So I just wanted to throw that in there in reaction to what you said, but we can continue to go over to Nathan for his thoughts on this as well.
Sure. Yeah, I won't repeat anything my colleagues have said, because I think your reaction just then, Audrey, is like, yeah, that's exactly. I can't say it any better than Mary. One thing I will add, and I gotta say I'm gratified to see OEIS here, and some cross proceeding staffing going on. There's one other, I think, one other major gap that comes to mind is the need for aligned understanding and assumptions across California's energy planning environment. So when we talk about uncertainty and assumptions, we really need to align together on, even just for basics of climate science, like are we planning to the 90th percentile of which scenario? Is it appropriate for some agencies to deviate from that standard for certain reasons? And I think that there's already some momentum towards figuring this out. For example, just the lexicon working group within the climate adaptation proceeding is a really important first step to defining what we mean when we say resilience. It means different things in different contexts. Or even making sure we're understanding the relationship between risk and the vulnerability analysis that goes on in the company. And so really like tranching that out and being very explicit is going to lead to greater understanding of all the policy people who are involved in this process, and we'll be able to get closer to a meaningful defined process over time. One other example, though, that was a very micro example of assumptions, macro assumptions, system planning and load forecasting being part of that is one of the major things that we all do together with the energy agencies. And, if any one of us is not climate informed or not climate informed enough, or climate informed differently, we already are sort of planning to the wrong thing or planning in a disjointed way. And so that's also going to be really important going forward. I'll stop there.
Hey, Nathan, this is Sarah Kareem. I'm one of Audrey's, on Audrey's staff. I just wanted to ask a follow-up about that alignment and coordination. In your opinion, and this can be for the whole panel, in fact, what are the best ways to get that alignment? Is it working groups? Is it workshops like this? What are the most efficient avenues that you guys see for all these different bodies to get on the same page?
Yeah,
I could.
Go ahead, Sandeep, if you want to respond.
I was going to take one of the easiest ones since we spoke about load forecasting. I think it was really helpful that in the last IPA, they chose a priority scenario, SSP 370, and that aligned with the CAVA requirements. So those sort of nuances, right? If someone is going to require projections, to be very clear on how these projections align. So CAVA is the foundation for climate adaptation planning at the utility. All of us are doing it, have been doing it for years. So making sure that any enhancement and application of CAVA in policy aligns with what CAVA is asking for and is not either saying something different, but is integrating that best available scenario. It's not just sufficient to have it for utilities. It's also then saying, well, if CalAdapt is the engine that all infrastructure planners use to do projections, what is the best available, translatable, accessible data on CalAdapt that can be used for energy demand, energy supply, asset hardening? So it's very important to have that consistency, but not have the utilities define it, but just make sure if it's been defined in policy once, it's applied everywhere for consistency and alignment. Sorry, Nathan, I jumped in, but it was directed to you. Go for it.
No, please, that was a great insight and one I wasn't thinking about. So thank you. To answer your question in kind of a brass tacks way, I will tell you what I see, and then I think hopefully we can sort of derive what a good way forward would be from that. And that's, I see a lot of different stakeholders in the energy space asking the question, like, how are we going to coordinate? But I've only seen researchers sort of feel like they have the seat and the direct mandate to go do that. So, there's a CEC grant funding grant that's out there right now that's about mapping the energy system and the impact of climate on that. And I've talked to that researcher a number of times to help them map that out. But I don't think right now there is a forum where we're talking about this across energy agencies in California. At least I'm not invited to it. And I think that there could be lots of ways to do that, right? But it's just that getting all the stakeholders at the table, finding the time to do it, that kind of thing. I think everyone wants it. I think everyone understands, who's working on this understands it's necessary, but it just hasn't happened yet.
And Nathan, I'll just add one more point. So on that one, just to be very specific, right? So there is a technical advisory council. It was funded through an EPIC grant. It's led, CEC is very engaged. And we do include multi-agency participation in addition to PSCs and academia. It's just that the representation across the agency might be one department. Now, I would just say the important thing is if there is a group like that, Technical Advisory Council, then whoever's representing the agency then has to do the cross-pollination across the different departments. So Nathan, I just want to acknowledge the TAC that you and I are both part of, right? And that is part of the CEC E3-led think tank.
Thanks, those are helpful. Oh yeah, please.
Sorry, I think my colleagues covered this quite well, but I will just add kind of enthusiastic agreement that yes, all agencies or entities overseeing critical infrastructure planning in the state should ideally be aligned to planning for the same climate projections and scenarios that allow us to all have similar views of exposure. And we think the climate adaptation proceeding has done a really good job of setting those standards, setting those views and laying them out so far, and should continue to be the venue in which those scenarios and that climate data are really put out and set as guidance for which climate data should be used for planning. I think that because this proceeding has also been kind of doing the CAVA work and doing the planning process work, we would like to see any other work that is done by the CPUC on climate adaptation, including potentially general orders or other directions, also be part of that same umbrella so that there is coordination you know, at least in the wide variety of things that the CPUC oversees along these lines, using the same scenarios, using the same climate data, being really aligned on where that's coming from, and using the I think wealth of knowledge and the participants that have been built up in this proceeding and the relationships with the climate science research community to really be informing those decisions.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for letting me interrupt. Back to you, Audrey.
Thanks. I wanted to pull the string actually on something that Nathan said, and it was something that was put out in the ruling questions prior to this workshop, talking about potential concepts that are in need of definition or refinement. So are there concepts or terms out there that we utilize that you think that the CPUC needs to adopt different definitions for, or work to refine more clearly? And by that I mean things such as climate adaptation, climate risk, resilience, climate hazards. Some of these have been defined within this proceeding, and so so if the answer is no, then that's also just fine. But I just wanted to kind of pull that thread a little bit, since we did put that out there before.
I would love to hear what my colleagues have to say on this, but my answer is yes. I think that there are some definitions out there. I think that since 2020, when the initial order came out, you know, for the proceeding that started in 2018, we've all learned a lot. And I think that we have a better understanding of what these terms mean in the specific context of utility planning and risk reduction. And I think with that lens, it's a good time to revisit these terms and make them clear and sort of fit for purpose in this context. I'll stop there.
And
Yeah, I think two paths. Sorry, Sandy. I'll say quickly. I think there are kind of two paths that already exist to do that, and one of them is the Climate Lexicon Working Group that Nathan mentioned before. In the climate adaptation proceeding, that's required to evaluate these terms. And then the other is really RAMP integration, right? So all of the IOUs are currently required to work on and file these climate risk pilots with RAMP, with the RAMP proceeding, and it's a joint effort between the climate teams and the RAMP teams at our IOUs. We will be filing this white paper in May 2026 at the same time as our RAMP and CABA filings, and a lot of these terms are actually already have very specific definitions in the RAMP context. And so as we are kind of doing that exercise, we're also working through these concepts kind of alongside our colleagues. And so I think consistent, like taking the learnings that we've got from the climate piece and really working them in how to this effort and how we're structuring these definitions is important. Where possible, I think aligning with other CPUC efforts such as RAMP would also be great. And maybe there are kind of edge cases in which there's just such different concepts that we won't be able to do that. But I think kind of understanding that these efforts are ongoing, and I think on that climate pilot timeline, so about a year from now, will hopefully yield some learnings about how to best look at the transferability of some of these concepts across proceedings and across concepts. Sorry, Cindy, go ahead.
Now, I was just going to add to what you and Nathan have pointed out, right? So the way I see this, Audrey, is one is just the pure definitions, right? So we can all agree on a definition. And so on that front, I would just say if CAL FIRE has a definition for hazard and that's generally acceptable, let's use that, right? It doesn't have to be defined in policy if it's already being used by practitioners who are solving it for resilience, right? So that's one. The second point I want to make on this one is the nuance and the applicability, right? So you could have the right definitions in RAMP, you could have the right definitions in CABA, but when you start measuring it and applying it, there is a lot of nuance. So just to give you an example, right? So uncertainty, very hard to quantify. Risk requires you to quantify. But when it comes to climate risk, you still need to describe what the probability of failure that you want to measure is. And that, again, is very granular and has to be, for SDG&E, it could be 3 days of extreme rainfall in succession. For PG&E, it could be 5 days, right? So there has to be flexibility in how you apply that notion of the hazard in your particular context for your infrastructure. The other thing is when you think about return periods, you have to look at historically what those return periods look like broadly and then narrowly. But then when you're quantifying risk, you also have to think about consequence, where your traditional definitions in RAMP may not apply fully to the cost benefit analysis for climate resilience, right? And then you have all the other definitions. FEMA has a definition, there are indicator series. So this gets complicated in a hurry. So my recommendation on definitions is let's choose the definitions that allow you to act in a manner that builds resilience, but not reinvent it, not just take it one for one, but really make it fit for purpose, which both Nathan and Anna have said, because just defining it from a definition standpoint is insufficient for this kind of application that we're talking about. And it's new to the utilities, right? It's new to a lot of people. And oftentimes climate scientists also, that's where they take issue that we took the science and applied it in a manner to calculate a risk, which is not what the models were intending. So we've got to bring in academia into this. We've got to bring in scripts into this. We've got to bring the brilliant brains from NOAA into this. This is beyond the utility to say, yeah, this has got a better definition. We just need to test whether the application is sufficient for what we can control and act on. Those are my points on that one.
Thank you so much, Sandeep. I could not agree more. Colin, do you have any thoughts on this question?
I'll just say that I agree with everything that has been said. Important to have fit for purpose definitions, but at the same time, there are lots of definitions floating out there, whether that's the IPCC or FEMA or CAL FIRE or whoever, those entities that do historically much more climate work than the electrical corporations or the CPUC. So it's important to take the lessons from our sister agencies, as well as any members of federal or international governance.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I guess we'll move on to this third question that I have on this slide. I think can be done to help improve the resiliency of California's electric infrastructure to climate hazards and expanding beyond wildfire. Sandeep, do you want to go first?
I think this one I'm going to cede to my colleagues. I've been going first a lot, so maybe go for it.
It's because you're right next to me on the screen, that's why.
Yeah, let me take a shot at this. It's a really interesting and big question, and I'm going to answer it from the experience we have over the last couple of years doing this. So obviously, there's maybe kind of three buckets to think about this in. So one is, what do you do in the near term about acute climate-driven hazards, right? We all know that we're experiencing more extreme events more frequently, and I think in that bucket there is, all three of the IOUs represented today have robust emergency planning and response programs that are actually quite good at restoring service after we have an event like this. I do think that there is an opportunity to climate inform this better to make sure that we're containing our costs associated with that over the long term. Yes, we're good at it, but it costs to restore after a big event, and we should be making sure the balance between restoration and investing in hardened resilience, so we don't have to go restore, is well balanced. So that's the acute near-term kind of stuff. The next bucket is, how do you just build general resilience over the long term? And Con Edison actually has a great model for thinking about this. The system doesn't turn over in terms of new assets once a year or once every 10 years. We're replacing on a decadal cycle. There's so many assets on the system with many long lives. And part of building resilience at a baseline level over the long term is, if you have a wedge, if you have all of your assets, on the x-axis, it's replacing things with equipment that has updated design standards so that it's fit for purpose for the next 50 years. And that's how you add value gradually over time to make just everything more robust. I think there's also a really important balance question there. As I alluded to earlier, it's sometimes difficult to make the case for a long-term payoff in value, when there are so many priorities competing for dollars today. And so we need to make sure we're valuing that resilience benefit so that it shows up next to our other priorities, and it just isn't always pushed off for the most immediate risk that we have in front of us. And then I think there's what do you do in the long term about kind of how do you change the grid and meet customer needs in what is going to be a fundamentally different world? And this is the most kind of, I guess, speculative or, I would encourage us to focus on the previous two categories, but eventually there may also need to be a discussion about how do we serve customers and fulfill our role using different methods than we have in the past? And you've already seen this a little bit with wildfire. We have some grid edge techniques or non-wires techniques that we would not have used to serve customers in the past, but the risk profile is just so great now that it actually does make sense to have a non-wires solution. And I think that's sort of its own third category of what does it look like for an IOU to innovate and be able to meet customer needs affordably and safely in a really challenging environment. I'll stop there.
I echo Nathan's comments. I think they're all very, very well put. And I think I will just kind of add maybe an emphasis to the piece of really using climate projections to inform construction design standards, planning processes, sizing decisions for infrastructure we are building today as we replace it, right? As we to understand the kind of load that we will face in the future, the kinds of demands that we will face in the system, and then ensure that climate projections are also part of that sizing and design decision for the infrastructure that we need to build to address those future needs of the system. We really have to consider it kind of holistically in that needs assessment. That's what allows us to account for these different needs at the same time, and really helps aid affordability, right? Because we can build something right the first time that accounts for all of these different disparate goals, and really adapts and helps adapt the system over time as we replace and upgrade infrastructure to infrastructure that is really sized and ready for the future conditions that we are projecting in our service territory.
Great. I'll add a few comments on this one. Totally agree with Anna and Nathan. The only point I'd like to make is, first of all, this workshop is a good starting point, right? Like we're discussing how do we go further than what we've done with Carver. But the important thing is in Carver, we did do a lot of work on understanding hazard-specific implications. We studied the exposure over the long, medium, near-term, acute, and chronic. We did look at asset health. We did go back to all the engineering teams because Carver requires you to study this on an asset-by-asset basis, and also services and operations. So there was a lot of scoring and methodology that went into Carver that allowed you to think about hazard-specific risks, assets, and vulnerable communities in a very joined-up way. Now, where you could improve it is, where we're touching on it now is ways to look at it is, are we planning at a median level? Is that, or are we doing tail risk? Are we doing extreme value analysis? So that kind of resiliency, like there has to be some clarity on, because when you go to operators, right, they understand that we're leading the process and it's nuanced, it's complicated, it's technical. They want something very simple that's actionable. And if it's a design standard, they want to know if I'm changing the threshold, is that coming from the American Society of Civil Engineers? Because me basing it on a model with tremendous uncertainty is not going to get them there. So I think to improve the resiliency of the infrastructure, we also need independent input from the people who are developing these materials that are going to make building standards, just inherently better. We need to make sure that the thresholds that today we operate to for known local conditions, if they are to be changed, what does that variability mean at a local level? And are we investing it in a manner that is actually improving resiliency, or are we maladapting? So it gets to a point of very clear mental maps and agreement beyond the policy teams, including my own team, with the engineers, where we have common ground on, yes, this is going to make things more resilient. And sometimes it's speaking their language on how they understand, the wind spans and the circuit health and the transformer specs. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in this to improve resiliency, and never to forget the community piece, right? So everything we've learned in Carver is, if you make your infrastructure resilient, you may still be socializing a cost that in the end does not mitigate the community resiliency piece, which you are designing your infrastructure resilience for, right? So the endpoints of how do you make sure that every decision you make to improve resiliency stays affordable and is beneficial and is in the right location for the right reasons. I'm giving you a lot of philosophical views here. I'm just, because, we've really had to toy with this one. It's the mental maps we have may not be the same mental maps everybody else in the company has, or in the state has, or nationally has, right? So how do we get there to make resilience actually be something we could say is happening in earnest at all levels. So.
If I could add just a few more pieces, I would, it sounds like you're all thinking about this already, but I would encourage both the CPUC and the electrical corporations to think about mitigations that have co-benefits. Of course, you know, wildfire is the ever-present danger in our minds, but certainly wildfire mitigations can also translate to increasing reliability and resilience for against other climate hazards like heat, in particular heat and storms. You know, when I think about resiliency, I think, you know, it is inexplicably tied to reliability, and that some wildfire mitigations that are in place, like EPSS and PSPS, reduce reliability and resiliency, and we need to find ways to reduce reliance on de-energizing systems in response to extreme hazards. And we need to make sure that communities who are vulnerable to these de-energizations, particularly rural communities, are able to keep lights on, particularly for critical infrastructure or access and functional needs customers, because those hospitals, fire stations, police stations, schools need that power in order to continue to do work during climate enhanced disasters or storms. Maybe that's microgrids. We haven't talked about that yet, but.
Thank you, Colin. It's important. And I know that there's a lot of ongoing work at the Commission also considering reliability on top of resilience and climate adaptation. So I think it's front of mind for many. Yeah. Sarah, do you want to move to the next slide? So I think we've had a broad conversation, and as we kind of move towards the end of the panel, I want to focus specifically more on general orders, and thoughts on how we can modify general orders if we need to modify general orders, and how we can do that, keeping in mind safety, reliability, and resilience. We presented some avenues that we thought we could go down potentially in approaching this, which is, I'll just remind everyone, which is kind of going through some of the general orders that we identified and opening up proceedings and modifying them. General orders are modified all the time, as GO 95 is currently being modified. And I think it's a laborious task if you're talking about these sweeping integrating changes that we want to make along some of these thematic categories we're talking about, you know, infrastructure design, construction, things like that, those are regulated by multiple general orders. And so it wouldn't be just modifying one. That's why we presented a different approach potentially, which is creating decisions along those lines that would impact what's in those general orders, but not directly modify those general orders. That could be in the form of a general order or a decision. And like we said before, it could be any of these things. It could be none of these things. It could be any approach. And so we just wanted to start that conversation. So I throw to the group, do you have any ideas specifically about general orders or pathway forward, both procedurally, but also more importantly, impactfully, of how we can utilize the general orders at CPUC to kind of make some of the changes that you guys have pointed out that could potentially be necessary?
I could take a shot at it, and then again, a lot of what I'm going to say, Audrey, is reacting to what I heard today, right? So early reactions. So please take it in that vein. So this is, you know, I think if our endpoint is geos are the way this becomes a reality faster, then that's one goal, right? Like doing it across the board, across the 9 themes, is going to just take time. So I think for me, is expediency one of the drivers? And if that is, then do we pick one geo? So it could be 95, could be 166, and look at that more holistically, and then use it as a pilot, right? To see, okay, are we getting the right impacts? Is it still rate neutral or rate positive? Is it benefiting the community along the 6 priorities that were discussed for climate adaptation? So I think for me, a measured approach, which could be a combination of 3 and 1, because when the courses of action slide was presented, it did say it's not mutually exclusive. So, do we get to a single geo, and if it's 95 or 166, I'm thinking emergency management, post recovery, right? So when we think about hazards, one is just the current measures for emergency management, preparedness, planning. The other is rebuilding, building back better to the resiliency requirements and the adaptation plans we've been working on. So how does that land, right? But if doing everything is going to be hard, and bringing everybody along is going to be hard. And there's a lot on this that will also, the value of doing it in a more surgical way, expediently, with the right consequence that's measurable, so you can do everything else we think needs to be done, is going to be key. So my recommendation is, this is a really great filtration, right? You filtered a lot of things. So thematically, maybe community vulnerability DVCs, which has been in a lot of policy, it should be somewhere in those themes. Maybe it is, and I just don't fully understand it, and we can discuss it more. But this whole notion of disadvantaged vulnerable communities, how is that incorporated? Because we are incorporating that both from a CAVA community engagement plan and RAMP and ESJ pilots, all of these things, right? So how do we make sure that is integrated into this kind of next step? And then does that mean we establish standards and rules for climate adaptation through a decision that then says, do this first with GEO 166 or 95? Let's pick one, and let's not make it onerous, right? Because if we make it too onerous, it's not just going to take time, it's going to get a lot of resistance, right? So I just want to, those are my initial reactions to, like, yes, we want to do it. And yes, it's great to have a list that is a narrow list, but within that list, is there room for refinement for the kind of desired outcomes that align with the priorities that were identified, that becomes a use case and an example for doing it in multiple places? But I'll hand it to Anna and Nathan on their comments.
Thank you, Sandeep. I like that proposal. And I agree that, if you kind of try to do everything all at once, it can become really hard to do anything. I think climate adaptation is such a broad ranging topic, and it has so many kind of tendrils already that I want to reiterate again that I really appreciate the effort that CPUC has already taken to really systematically study these general orders and down select them to get us to a set that feels manageable. But even within that, there may be some that are kind of more appropriate or less appropriate for the kind of effort or the kind of at least initial priorities in this effort that we're all talking about. So I like the idea of being kind of tactical and surgical and choosing one, using it as a pilot. I think something that we'll need to really think through as we do that, regardless exactly of how this process kind of happens in a functional way, is really how that general order is actually used. So for us, we really think about GEOs as a baseline for how we construct and build infrastructure. And then we also have internal asset design standards that further guide how we construct and build infrastructure. And those consider the GEOs, and they comply with the GEOs, but they also consider other industry standards like IEEE for design and construction. They consider characteristics that may be specific to each asset class that we're talking about, and then location-specific characteristics within our own service territory. And there's sufficient variability among asset classes, among utility service areas and equipment, that a one-size-fits-all approach is often not appropriate. And really the extent to which it is appropriate is going to depend on the very granular details of the particular GEO we're talking about, of the particular requirement in that GEO that we're talking about, and the folks who are really experts in those things should be the ones to be weighing in at those places. But I think there's kind of this need also for coordination with our internal risk assessment processes that are designed to really manage evolving risks and respond to those evolving risks in an appropriate kind of granular, flexible way. That we do need to consider as we're going through this. We can't predefine that in all cases. And so kind of thinking about and really learning from the people who are the real experts on the implementation of any particular GEO and how it applies to a particular set of infrastructure and a particular set of decisions, I think is going to be really important. And so that's another reason I like Sandeep's suggestion of the surgical piece, because going that deep into depth, I think, is more manageable maybe if you're focusing on one and looking at that one and using it as a little bit of a pilot. And then I think in the spirit of aligning then whatever it is we're doing with that particular scope of geos as it's decided with broader climate adaptation work in general, I think I guess I will just feel like I reiterate again the importance of using the climate proceeding, the existence climate proceeding as a bit of a home for this, right? Where we can be considering this alongside the planning process work and alongside the CAVA work, and really making sure that we are staying consistent and aligned with the climate data that should feed into this, how that climate data can best be used, how it's suitable to be used, and so forth. Maybe I'll make one additional point, and before passing it over. I think one thing we've learned a lot about as we've been doing the climate work so far is climate projections and just how to appropriately think about climate data. How climate data can be used in actionable ways for practitioner decision making. We've learned a lot from the climate scientists in the state of California, folks who work with CalAdapt on these pieces, and something that I think is really important to be considering and keeping in mind as we go through this work is that the climate projections that we have and the ways that these climate models are set up, they're really best suited to inform long-term planning. So planning that is at minimum 5 years out, even better maybe if it's 10 years out. And so this can include planning processes that are making decisions in the short term, right? If you're making a decision 2 months from now to build an asset, but that asset is going to have a much longer lifespan, so it's going to exist for a long period of time. That's where climate projections that speak to future conditions, at least 5 years out, can give you a picture of what conditions that asset may experience over its lifetime so that you're making prudent decisions about how to size and design this asset with those considerations in mind. But climate projections are not very well suited to inform short-term actions. So this can include maintenance, inspections, exactly, how that comes down on any individual general order and any decision. I think we can kind of talk about more in depth, but as a general picture, and I think this is, if there's kind of interest in looking across the spectrum of these, I would also encourage maybe bringing in some of the climate scientists in this conversation who could maybe speak to the nuances on this a little bit more than I can, but there is that difference. And so I think in thinking about goals like informing long-term planning, informing site selection, construction, equipment tolerance, climate projections can be really well suited to those goals. Maybe less well suited to some of the other goals, but that's maybe a selection criteria if we decide to get surgical, or that's at least something to consider as we take steps. I'll pass it to Nathan.
Yeah, great points from both of my colleagues here. I'll reemphasize something Anna said, which is just that the geo, to really answer this question, I think our team is working internally to map how the geos are used. Our general understanding is just like Anna said, that there's sort of a basis for further design decision making. And so, before we made a specific recommendation about where to start or how to go about it, I think, we want to take a little bit of time to understand really what would be most influential and maybe most worthwhile to start on. And then I also agree, this comes up so often, or it's been our experience over the last couple of years, that every time we think that we have an easy job to do with climate integration, we get started and it's really hard because it's almost always a unique problem that you have to solve. And so I really like the approach of starting small and then maybe going from there, because otherwise we might get bogged down. I'll just give you a quick example. We updated something called the Summer Temperature District Map, which is a map that underlies a lot of our standards for sizing of transformers. And in the old world, there was a coastal and there was a interior designation. You had to have a bigger transformer if you were interior because it got hotter. And what we did over the course of this process was realize there's really not a coastal designation anymore. It's hot everywhere and it's going to get worse. And we no longer have a reason to make the distinction. That part of the conversation took 3 months. The climate data was applied. We were able to update a map. The map was from 1977. So the hard part there was just digitization. But the point is, it then took us another 18 months to get this standard adopted because the number of questions that it raised about how other things would be impacted down the line in planning was enormous. This wasn't an unnecessary 18 months. This was, okay, we have an idea for how to update this. We have the climate data to do it. But now what happens from a financial perspective, from a compliance perspective, if we have a set of equipment that is was in place over old standards, and now we have a new one. This gets down to like questions as brass tacks as, well, if we eliminate the old standard, now we're only buying these larger transformers. How much is that going to cost us? What's the differential? When do we start? So I offer that as one example of how the knock-on implications can be really complex. And I'll point to one element of the general orders that I think probably will be that way, which is the build back better versus replace like for like. This is an obvious one from a policy perspective. Let's build back better. But from an engineering and compliance perspective, there are a lot of questions right away. So I hope that's a useful example. Stop there.
I'll echo what others have said. We've talked a lot philosophically about long-term planning during this workshop, and I think the long-term planning element, of course, is key to this proceeding. But in terms of the general orders, like that is our opportunity to take actions that we know can mitigate risk right now. Whether that's prohibiting installation of non-exempt equipment in the HFTD, or I had so many things, or the risk-informed inspections. I'm glad to hear that the electrical corporations are using the general orders as baselines, but it is energy safety's positions that baseline should be raised in many areas, so they can meet that expectation, not only from energy safety, but from the CPUC, to achieve the highest amount of safety that they are able to do. Also there are ways that we can modify the general orders to set ourselves up for success, whether that's creating requirements for asset inventories that are essential to long-term planning, or weather stations and weather data collection that also inform long-term planning. I see Nathan has a hand.
Yeah, I wanted to respond really quickly with the clarification and also a further comment. So, when we say we use them as the basis, they really are the basis. Almost all of PG&E's design guidelines are, much more robust than what is baseline required. And I say that to point out one other dynamic that I think we'll need to manage here, which is that there's actually a lot of pressure to down design some of our equipment and our standards, because there's such a desire for new capacity and build out to get on the system faster than ever. So in this moment, when we're trying to make sure that we're being deliberate and build up as much resilience as we need to, there's also the EV revolution and the AI revolution going on. And there are some folks who are getting pressure in the standards group to actually see if we can do less so that we can go further with less money. And obviously we're not going to do anything that's unsafe, but this is a conversation. And so I just want to note that there's sort of two competing priorities there in terms of, okay, do we need to go more robust right now because it's going to pay off in the long term, or do we need to go fast right now because there's these immediate needs being driven by capacity? So sort of a strategic consideration.
I'll comment as well quickly. I actually agree with Colin a lot on the multi-solving bit that you've touched on, right? So it doesn't have to be, everything has to be perfect, but to the extent we are doing anything, is it being informed by the best set of data, right? So I think that is a principle we've all embraced, right? Nathan's got this, and across our utilities, because of what we've done in Kava, that got institutionalized, that we are going to have this data set, because we had to interview all the engineers, right? Like for asset scoring, we had to go asset by asset categories, make sure asset health came into play, all the GIS data came into play. We then had to score what the asset hazard combination is. And then we had to think about operational resilience. What have we done for PSPS planning? All of the work we've done in wildfire mitigation. How does that build any kind of adaptive capacity? So a lot of that work, right, Colin, has happened. But your point is well taken that we've got to do more. But I think the challenge we're all faced with is, as we look at competing priorities and the affordability crisis, how do we do it smarter, that the decision is the right one, without that incremental burden of having to always choose one or the other action because it's unaffordable. And that is going to be something we'll all have to do across all proceedings, right? So, but I wanted you to know that with Kava, we are on that journey. With WMP, we're on that journey. It's just making sure we are not reducing or muting all the good work that goes on in geos that is ensuring safety and reliability, but something new that may have knock-on effects or upstream and downstream implications which aren't addressed fully in just pure climate adaptation. So just wanted to be the mediator on that one, Nathan, sorry.
Thank you, Sandeep. I think you guys answered my last question. So for me, we can end on the second to last question here, which is an important one. How do we feel about maintaining positive or neutral impacts on ratepayer affordability while we continue to move forward with these climate adaptation policies?
I have two thoughts, and then I'm going to be very quick since I have said quite a bit. One is, I think we need to make sure there's economies of scale, right? So one way is to make sure all the work we are doing gets shared, more people do it. And that could be Con Edison doing it in New York, right? And sharing it with us. So sharing it, making sure, understanding it, and if it's fit for purpose, applying it and not having to reinvent it. So a lot of collaboration, and not just with other utilities, but across sectors, right? If somebody's got a great CAT model that does climate risk, instead of me having to hire consultants to interpret what I've learned in climate science, let's use what everybody's accepting as the best available way to analyze climate risk. So I think we have the climate intelligence platform. I know there's a lot of work happening with CEC for visualizing vulnerability. Let's pool the resources and make it impactful and execute it quickly, right? So I think the positive and neutral impacts will come from coalition building, collaboration, and leveraging everything that's already been done in a manner that's useful, but also not duplicative, right? So those are early thoughts, but we also have to recognize that to the extent these point to additional building standards, material replacement, building back better, there is a direct implication, but the implication is spend now to save later. So how is cost avoidance being discussed, right? So there's a lot of data that says $1 spent today leads to a saving of $6 later. But in the rate making context, that doesn't quite work, right? Because there's an upfront capital allocation and the cost is getting socialized and the damage is uncertain. So what is the mechanism for that recovery? How do we explain that in the traditional cost benefit framework or the RDF? Because doing it to maintain positive and neutral in many cases will lead to inaction, right? And that's the conundrum we're faced with. But that's my final point on that one. I'll give it to Anna or Nathan.
Okay, I see Nathan motioning. So I'll go ahead and I'll let Nathan have the last word on this. So yeah, I think I echo Sandeep's points. I think those are very well stated. I think that's something we struggle with and we find a challenge as well. I think really multi-benefit. Like we need to make sure that we are accounting for the different projects and the different costs that we have as we are figuring out how to design and size investments appropriately. And that those planning processes and design standards that we are using are really focused on incorporating the load growth, incorporating the climate projections to be able to build infrastructure right the first time. And that may mean that we need to build infrastructure that is more hardened or upsized from what we would have built if we had not incorporated climate projections. And while that may mean higher upfront costs for ratepayers, we expect it to still be a more affordable path than needing to repair that equipment or replace that equipment prematurely once it has already been built, because it was built and sized to kind of historical exposure information rather than future conditions. And so, yes, I think better thinking through the regulatory frameworks and the cost benefit frameworks for how do you really do that, and in particular use cases, will be really important and is a challenge I think we all need to kind of embark on together. And climate adaptation is another infrastructure pressure that we have to balance, but we have to be able to account for that upfront rather than as an add-on or an augmentation or a fix once we've either already built the equipment or the design work has already been performed, to make sure that we are kind of holistically accounting for all of these different priorities and these different goals, so that we can build the system really considering what it will need to be able to handle in the future. pass it to Nathan.
Yeah, I think I'm reiterating what we've already heard here, but fundamentally, like philosophically, this is one of the ways in which our carbon-based global system is going to come home and have a direct impact on the people we serve. There will be costs associated with adapting to climate change. Doing this well means that we're considering resilience alongside the other investment priorities that we have to deliver on also for our customers. They expect that too. And so doing this well looks like building resilience in the near term while essentially minimizing the marginal costs associated with that. It also has to do with avoiding huge costs in the long term if we don't do this now. And so that's really it. It's about if we do this in an organized, risk-based way, then we can minimize the additional cost that comes with having to operate in a fundamentally more hostile environment. But I think that we have to be really frank with ourselves about the fact that this is going to cost something. If we do it right, it will cost less and the results will be better.
Colin, any final thoughts on this question?
I'll just echo what everyone else has said, that affordability is so important during this time. I think, all of the electrical corporations were able to implement wildfire mitigation very quickly, and we have seen the result in rates and how impactful it can be on affordability. This short-term hardening for long-term gain, and it's something that we need to think about in going forward. And energy safety continues to work with the CPUC in order to integrate cost-benefit ratios into the wildfire mitigation plans, and we continue to explore how energy safety and the CPUC can coordinate on affordability, particularly when it relates to wildfire mitigation.
Thank you, Colin. So those are all the questions that I have for the panel. I wanted to open it up either to some of my colleagues or any of the participants in the workshop if they want to ask anything of the panelists or ask questions about anything else that was presented today. Christopher Parks, feel free to come off mute.
Thank you. So you mentioned the workshop or anything else today. I was going to ask if it's still possible to go back to one of the earlier slides. I think it was 58. Excuse me.
Sure.
So if we go back in time to, about maybe 10 years ago, I mean, one of the hazards that the electrical system faces is wires down. And there was a risk assessment done in Northern California where, the real concern was the number of wires down, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of breath, maybe 8 or more a day on average in Northern California. And the concern was maybe a third of the time, roughly, those wires may not trip, they may remain energized. Fast forward to today with the concern about climate. Now the big concern is, can those energized wires be a source of an ignition for a wildfire? So climate has definitely increased the risk, the impact on ratepayers and customers, and the impact on the enormous consequences from a wildfire. If we look at these different courses of action, one of it, the third one is to talk about through a decision. But I think one of the things that's lost with number 3 is what happens when the focus is on general orders, as was stated earlier, like this is a real focus is on general orders. One of the big advantages of a general order is the commission then will conduct an audit. And so through an audit, the commission can uncover shortcomings and then address corrective actions, thereby preventing a catastrophic event, which all of the enormous costs inherent with that. So, so one of the things that might happen after a catastrophic wildfire or any other catastrophic event is the commission will conduct an investigation. And a lot of times they will then uncover the root causes of it. And sometimes or often the commission may uncover work that never got completed. So if we want to address those enormous consequences and costs on customers, the general order concept is a way of being able to bring those to light and to conduct audits and then to have those corrective actions in place. When we mentioned earlier General Order 167, that is for power plants, and the commission adopted that with some pretty broad standards, and among them include maintenance and operation standards. And through that, the commission audits power plants for making sure that that maintenance gets done and thereby addressing risks before they become realized. And so after the Northern California wildfires and through the consultant's report that the commission reviewed, the recommendation was, as I posted in that link, specific recommendations to General Order 95 and other general orders in order to address those concerns. So one of the issues with a general rate case or some other decision is that there's no follow-up. There's generally no audit. There's no follow-up to ensure that everything has been looked at. But through having those general orders, like General Order 167, then the commission is doing that on a proactive basis, and therefore it's effective in addressing these risks and these costs. So, and in looking at the first two courses of action, it would seem like actually it may not necessarily have to be either one or the other, but one way the commission could address this issue is to make changes maybe broadly, adopting those GO 167 type operation and maintenance standards, and then apply them to the other general orders. And then there may be some specific ones that could then be addressed in a specific general order. But you know, a lot of focus, I think, in this discussion has been on planning and the future, which is all really important. But from a ratepayer perspective and the cost, it's really important that there's oversight to make sure that work gets done. One of the issues concerned then is if the commission does an investigation, finds that, you know, one of the root causes is that work was never completed, that's work that was already paid for, it was funded by the commission, but then it wasn't ever completed. So the general order provides a vehicle to address those risks and make sure that work is completed. So the general order concept is a critical portion of this, and then being able to take the lessons learned, as Colin was mentioning earlier, take those and apply them and proactively reduce those risks in advance. And that saves customers the huge cost to rebuild after a wildfire, the huge cost of all the lost property after a wildfire. If that work can be completed and the commission oversees it and there's a place in it for the general order so that the commission is auditing that, that's a really important proactive step to reduce the impact and cost on ratepayers. So anyway, I wanted to add that to the mix, please.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I think that's very helpful, especially as we think about how to move forward. And we'll definitely make note of what you said and consider it. Are there any other questions or thoughts from any of our participants today?
Audrey, there's a question in the chat. It's hard for me to see it because I'm sharing my screen.
Oh, here we go. So Ken Howard from SBUA. are the CPUC, IOUs, and EIS in alignment on the benefit cost analysis to be applied? How will intangible benefits and costs be quantified? How to ensure that DVCs are treated equitably?
So I want to address the last part of this question quickly because Sandeep mentioned something and I wanted to jump in on the DVC's point because when we did the analysis of the general orders and created the thematic categories came out of the information that we were reading in the general order. So they're not we're not imposing what we think should happen. It was commonalities that we saw across the general orders, and DVCs aren't really mentioned within the general orders, which is why they didn't become a category. That doesn't mean that it won't be foundational to any of the work that we do moving forward. So I just wanted to say that. Are the CPUC, IOUs, and EIS in alignment on benefit cost analysis to be applied? There's certainly tools that we've mentioned throughout this workshop that are commonly used across all of those entities, and I believe that we are in alignment on that. But I think that's definitely something that can get teased out through this work. Same for the how will intangible benefits and costs be quantified. Those are things that are done through a lot of the tools that we talked about today as well. And I think further codification is always useful on those. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that question.
I was going to say that I think we are aligned on how to calculate benefit cost in like CBR through RAMP. How those CBR ratios are applied to the work that we're doing, I'm not sure that that is consistent. But I could be wrong. Maybe
Thanks,
the IOUs know better. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure either. So thank you for that. Okay, anything else? Any other comments or questions?
Hey. Yeah, sorry, this is Nathan from PG&E. I think, this gets back to, I think we do have alignment that IOU planning should be risk-based and that the mitigations put into place should make sense from a risk mitigation cost benefit perspective. And so the methodology is, coordinated in the sense that we're all beholden to the risk-based decision-making OIR requirements. I think that how we quantify the value of resilience is something that remains to be discussed and probably is critical to this conversation. So I just wanted to put that up.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Miles Gordon from Cal Advocates. I just wanted to add on to what Chris Parks was saying earlier, and I also just wanted to make the general comment that if we're talking about increasing resilience, at least in my mind, doing the maintenance right and doing the work you were supposed to be doing is a fundamental part of that. And so I would really encourage us to look at those two things first. And for example, like applying General Order 167 type maintenance and operations standards to other general orders would be an excellent place to start for that. And that would also potentially avoid a lot of potentially unnecessary CapEx because you've already decreased the risk. That's it. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we'll definitely, I briefly looked at the report that was sent earlier, and we'll definitely take a much deeper dive on that as we move forward in this work. Yes, Christopher.
Thank you. Just in response to the chat message about are the CPC IOUs and EIS in OEIS, I guess, in alignment on the benefit cost analysis. I'm not an expert on what's been happening in the WMPs compared to what's happening in the ramps, but and in the commission's RDF risk rulemaking proceeding, but there may be a difference in that I believe for example, in the WMPs, when they do this analysis for cost benefit, there may be a expectation for a neutral scaling of risk, whereas it could be in the ramps that there is a different scaling, so that the utility may put a greater weight on a risk, and in so doing also claim a greater benefit or a greater risk reduction from a mitigation. Others may know more about this, but I was just going to flag that there might be some differences in that when it comes to what's happening in the risk and mitigation phase proceedings, the ramps, compared to what's happening in the WMPs. But others may know more about that. But it's just, there may be some differences in terms of how that's being done and how that's going to flow.
Thanks for that, Christopher. I'm not an expert, so I don't want to speak from a place of authority on that. So I'll let that lie for now, unless someone else knows for certain.
I will say I will also let that lie because I am not an expert in the risk modeling or cost benefit analysis part of the WMP.
Yeah, we can get back to you though. Are there additional venues, events dedicated to information sharing and subject matter expertise on best practices for prioritization of resilience investments? Does anyone have anyone else on the call have an answer to the question that's in the chat outside of the things that were mentioned today already on the panel?
I'll just reiterate, I know we've talked about the CEC a little bit at the California Energy Commission, but I'm sure that there are conversations over there about best practices for prioritization and resilience.
And I'll say that we are prioritizing having CEC be involved in this process moving forward. So they will be integral in our planning and work that we do in this phases proceeding.
I'll also add just quickly that we've been participating, as I know some of the other IOUs on this call also have been, in EPRI's Resilience and Adaptation Initiative. This is across electric power sector industry initiative that has been going on the last few years, trying to basically collect and coordinate the industry on how do we think about best practices for incorporating climate information into understanding the risks we face, understanding how they may affect our assets and our systems. And so that's a great space also where people have been grappling with some of these questions, and has been a good place for us to kind of check and sanity check our own thinking around industry best practices and industry thinking. And that effort has included utilities as well as researchers, regulators, and kind of other folks involved in some of these decisions. So that's worthwhile checking out as well.
I remembered another one as well. I'll give a shout out to the governor's task force on wildfire resilience, wildfire and forest resilience task force. They do great work. They often have a seat at the table for energy safety, the CPUC, and many other sister agencies as we discuss how utilities impact wildfire and forest resilience.
Thank you, Colin and Anna. So as we're winding down here, I just want to give a really heartfelt thank you to our panelists, Anna, Nathan, Sandeep, Colin. It's very, very fruitful discussion. I really appreciate you all giving such thoughtful answers to all of my questions and helping us kind of push this process forward in this part of the proceeding. Any questions that people have? Oh, some effort has been done in New York. That's helpful. Thank you. So as moving forward, feel free to reach out to me if there's additional questions on any of the work that we've done, and we'll reach out to our panelists if you have questions on the work that they're doing. Sarah, you want to move to the next slide? I'll just wrap this up really quickly saying reiterating what Commissioner Houck had said this morning, which is following up, ruling will be issued with questions for parties. So there'll be an opportunity to formally and in writing address some of the things that we've talked about today. And we will post the recording for this workshop. And I think unless there's anything else that anybody wants to say from my team or anywhere else, I think that's the end of our workshop today. I really, again, want to thank everybody for participating and for attending. It was very helpful for all of us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Audrey. Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.